July 16, 1940, Berlin. In the heat of a German summer, the war appears, on paper, to be nearly finished. France has fallen, the Channel coast is in German hands, and senior commanders in the army and navy look across a narrow strip of water at an opponent they have not destroyed, but still expect to bargain with. Hitler's own Führer Directive No. 16 is framed as a contingency. Britain, despite her hopeless military situation, shows no sign of willingness to come to terms, so preparations begin for a landing operation. That single premise reveals the first gap in understanding. Many German commanders had been shaped by a Continental logic: crush the enemy's field armies, take key ground, impose a political decision. In the West, that logic had worked with breathtaking speed. Yet Britain's way of war was rarely built around one decisive land battle on the continent. As an island power, it had survived setbacks on land by leaning on the sea blockade and economic pressure, global supply routes, and the ability to fight on as part of a wider coalition. The decision Britain sought was often cumulative: the slow tightening of maritime control, the wearing down of an opponent's resources, and the expansion of the conflict until Britain's partners and industrial base outweighed the enemy's early victories. German staffs could see the Royal Navy, but too many treated it as a complication rather than the central fact. An invasion plan could be drafted. The harder question was whether Germany could command the Channel long enough to make that plan real, and whether air attack alone could force political collapse. Even within German assessments, doubts surfaced about prerequisites Germany could not meet: control of the air, control of the sea, and secure shipping capacity under enemy naval pressure. Britain, meanwhile, was already shifting into a long war posture, tightening economic warfare, protecting Atlantic lifelines, and thinking in terms of theaters and systems rather than a single front. Churchill's strategic instincts, shared by much of Britain's strategic culture, favored indirect pressure and peripheral choices when a direct clash would be ruinous. So when German commanders asked, sometimes sincerely, why won't they negotiate, they were asking from inside their own assumptions. Britain was not trying to win July 1940 in the way Germany defined winning. It was trying to avoid decisive defeat, keep access to the oceans, and turn time, industrial, diplomatic, and global, into a weapon. In the German operational mind, the next step after France was to translate battlefield dominance into political surrender. But Britain had spent centuries learning how to avoid exactly that trap. German commanders were looking for the moment when London would admit defeat. Britain was looking for the moment when Germany would be forced to fight a war it could not sustain. That difference was built into geography. For Britain, the Royal Navy was not just another service branch. It was the strategic shield that kept the state alive when armies were beaten on land. If the sea lane stayed open, Britain could import food and raw materials, move forces around its wider empire, and keep the option of rebuilding an army in being. And if the sea lanes were threatened, Britain's response was not to gamble everything on one continental throw, but to expand the struggle outward: convoys, blockade, distant bases, and gradual strangulation of an opponent's war economy. German planning for a landing in 1940 reveals how hard this was to internalize. Hitler's directive of July 16 set preparations in motion, but the conditions attached to it were telling. The Luftwaffe had to beat down the RAF, the Channel had to be cleared and controlled, and British naval forces had to be neutralized long enough for barges and transports to cross. Those were not minor details. They were admissions that Britain could survive so long as its air and sea defenses held, because Britain's center of gravity, in practical terms, was the ability to remain an armed island connected to the world. Here is where German commanders often misread British behavior as stubbornness or irrational pride. In reality, Britain's leadership in 1940 acted with a cold logic of endurance. Churchill's message to the country, whatever one thinks of his rhetoric, was tied to a strategic calculation: hold the home islands, keep the fleet intact, preserve the air force, and ensure Britain remains a base from which the war can be continued. The aim was not immediate victory, in the continental sense, but survival until the balance of resources and alliances shifted. That is why German commanders could win battles and still fail to understand the war they were in. They kept asking when Britain would stop fighting, while Britain was reorganizing the conflict into something Germany could not easily end: an attritional struggle of oceans, production, and time. And once you see that, the next question becomes sharper. If invasion was the supposed solution, could Germany actually meet the conditions needed to make it possible? August 11, 1940, Bentley Priory, on the edge of London. In the headquarters of RAF Fighter Command, a wall map and a constant flow of reports turned the skies into a controlled system. German commanders were preparing to solve the British problem, the way a continental war teaches you to solve problems. Apply overwhelming force, break the opponent's main arm, and the political structure will follow. But Britain's air defense in 1940 was not a single arm to be smashed in a clean, decisive blow. It was an integrated network: radar, the Royal Observer Corps, filter rooms, sector stations, and fighters held back until the last responsible moment, built precisely to prevent the kind of sudden collapse German operational art relied upon. From the German perspective, the Battle of Britain could look like a conventional contest of attrition. Find the RAF, destroy it, clear the way for invasion craft. Yet, the British system did not behave like the target they expected. Radar stations, chain home, gave early warning of raids approaching the coast, allowing controllers to concentrate fighters where they were needed and conserve strength elsewhere. The result was a kind of economy of force in the air, not a constant scramble of exhausted squadrons, but measured commitments shaped by information. This matters because Sea Lion, as a military concept, was never just about putting soldiers on beaches. It depended on time in which slow barges and tugs could cross, unload, and be resupplied, all under the threat of the Royal Navy. German leaders understood, at least in theory, that the Luftwaffe would have to do double work: defeat the RAF and keep the Royal Navy from attacking the invasion flotilla. Post-war summaries of German thinking, including captured assessments and later parliamentary reporting in Britain, underline the same uncomfortable logic. German naval leaders doubted the Kriegsmarine could match the Royal Navy, and doubted the Luftwaffe could reliably stop it even if the RAF had been beaten down. British commanders were not romantic about this. They were pragmatic. Their aim was to deny Germany the clear conditions a continental power wanted for a decisive landing: keep fighter command functioning, keep the fleet intact, and force Germany into a war of friction it could not quickly end. That is why German commanders could watch raids, tonnage figures, and sortie counts and still misread what was happening. Britain was not seeking a single clean decision, but building a layered defense whose purpose was to make every German solution multiply into new problems. September 3, 1939, the Western approaches, off Ireland. Before most German commanders could even name the decisive battle they expected to fight in the West, the contest that would determine whether Britain could remain in the war was already underway. Merchant ships pushing through an ocean that was vast, exposed, and essential. Britain's way of war depended on importing food, oil, and raw materials, then converting them into endurance and fighting power. In other words, the Atlantic was not a distant sideshow. It was a front line measured in cargoes landed and days survived. This was a second gap in German understanding. Many senior German army commanders were shaped by land campaigns where victory was visible on maps and achieved by breaking enemy formations. Britain's strategic culture treated sea control and logistics as the map. To protect that lifeline, merchant ships were grouped into convoys and escorted by warships and, when possible, aircraft. The method looks defensive until you grasp its logic. In the Atlantic scale, finding a convoy could be harder than finding scattered single ships, and when U-boats attacked, escorts and aircraft could counterattack immediately. That was Britain applying its preferred kind of war-making: system versus system, organization versus disruption, rather than staking everything on one continental moment. German naval leaders did understand the arithmetic of a tonnage war, and the U-boat campaign aimed to sink shipping faster than Britain and its partners could replace it. But from Berlin in 1940, there was still a tendency to believe Britain would crack psychologically, through bombing, through invasion threats, or through a few dramatic blows at sea. Britain's response was designed to deny that quick decision. It was methodical. Refine convoy procedures, expand escort production, extend air cover where possible, and keep the flow moving even when the losses were painful. So while German commanders searched for a single final decision, Britain kept choosing endurance. Defend the island, keep the sea lanes functioning, and let the enemy bleed effort into a problem that rarely offered a knockout punch. And as this maritime struggle widened, a reality became impossible to ignore. Britain's way of war assumed allies would matter, and it was built to keep the country fighting until the balance of global resources turned decisively against Germany. December 7, 1941, London. News from the Pacific arrives like a door being kicked open in a locked room. German commanders had spent years trying to force Britain into a single final decision, through blockade, air attack, and the threat of invasion, yet Britain's underlying strategic instinct was to prevent precisely that kind of closure. Its way of war assumed that time was not neutral. Time could be spent building alliances, expanding production, tightening economic warfare, and turning a European conflict into a global one that Germany could not control. That is why German leaders repeatedly misread British persistence as irrational. In British terms, it was strategic. Survive long enough for the coalition to harden and the balance of resources to swing. This is also why the German question, "Why won't Britain negotiate?" was always slightly misplaced. Britain was not simply refusing an offer. It was making itself the platform from which Germany would eventually be confronted by a larger combined effort. The emphasis on sea power, convoys, and keeping the home base intact was not an end in itself. It was the foundation for coalition war. Britain as an armed island that could host air forces, train armies, coordinate shipping, and keep pressure on multiple fronts. Even the language of German invasion planning in 1940, with its heavy dependence on conditions that had to be met first, points to the same structural reality. Britain's survival depended on systems, air defense, naval control, logistics, rather than on one field army being destroyed. German commanders often excelled at operational problems. How to break through, how to encircle, how to force a decision in weeks. Britain's approach forced them into strategic problems that did not yield to a single campaign. The convoy system, for example, was not glamorous, but it expressed Britain's logic perfectly. Organize risk, absorb losses, keep the flow moving, and deny the enemy a decisive interruption. The same method showed up in how Britain managed intelligence, research, and industrial mobilization, patient, procedural, and cumulative. Once the Grand Alliance took shape, the contrast became even starker. German commanders could win battles and still lose the war's direction, because the contest Britain was fighting was not only over territory. It was over production, shipping, and the ability to coordinate multiple powers over years. By late 1941, the war Britain had chosen, endurance until coalition strength becomes overwhelming, was no longer a theory. It was becoming the central fact Germany had to confront, whether German commanders understood it or not. By the time German commanders fully grasped what they were facing, it was already too late to change the fundamentals. Britain's way of war had never depended on winning quickly. It depended on refusing to lose decisively while expanding the conflict into domains where Britain's strengths and Germany's weaknesses would steadily assert themselves. Air defense denied a clean solution from the sky. Sea power kept the country supplied and connected to the wider world. Economic warfare strained Germany's access to resources, and alliance building transformed a bilateral struggle into a global contest of production and endurance. This was the core misunderstanding. German commanders were trained to look for the enemy's breaking point, the moment when pressure translated into surrender. Britain's strategic culture aimed to erase that moment altogether. The British system did not promise dramatic victories in the short term. It promised continuity. As long as Britain remained in the war armed, supplied, and politically intact, Germany's early successes could not be converted into a final outcome. Every year the war continued altered the balance further against the Reich. In hindsight, many German officers acknowledged this mismatch. Post-war reflections repeatedly circle the same theme. Britain was not defeated because it was never forced into the kind of war Germany knew how to finish. German operations were often brilliant at the tactical and operational level, but Britain shifted the contest upward, to strategy, to economics, to coalition management, where battlefield victories alone could not decide the issue. That is why Britain could absorb disasters and continue, while Germany needed success to be rapid and decisive. One system was built for resilience, the other for momentum. When momentum stalled, Britain endured. When endurance became the decisive factor, Germany had no answer. Understanding this contrast does more than explain a single campaign or a failed invasion plan. It explains why German commanders kept expecting Britain to behave rationally, according to their own experience, and why Britain never did. Britain was fighting a different kind of war, shaped by centuries as a maritime power and refined under the pressure of survival in a global conflict. And in the end, that difference mattered more than any single battle. Britain did not defeat Germany by outmatching it blow for blow in 1940. It defeated Germany by staying in the war long enough for time, industry, and alliances to become weapons in their own right. If you want more World War II history explained through strategy, systems, and the decisions that shaped the war, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know which story you'd like to explore next.